Thanks everybody for joining. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk at this event. Everyone I've seen so far has been great, so hopefully I live up to what has come before me. So today's topic is going to be mainly around starting a blog. My name is Khalid Abuhakmeh, and my Twitter handle is @Buhakmeh. It's kind of a joke, but it's up there. My job today is dev advocate. I mainly focus on .NET with Martin and other folks at JetBrains. We blog professionally at blog.jetbrains.com/.net. So check that stuff out if you're interested in Rider or ReSharper or anything .NET that folks are doing. So I really recommend that. I also blog personally on my own site. You can actually get to my blog through multiple domains. There's abuhakmeh.com, khalidforamerica.com, just kind of a joke since we're in a political year, khalidabuhakmeh.com, and some other permutations. If you haven't noticed, I have a domain problem. I could probably fund a small island nation somewhere with all the domains I've purchased. So yeah, I don't recommend it, but I have a problem. So I would say I've been blogging for about 10 years, and that's kind of a conservative estimate. It's probably been a little longer, and I've learned a few things over those 10 years. I've blogged on .NET platforms, I've blogged on other people's platforms, and today I use a static site generator, which you'll kind of see later in this talk. But I have a lot of experience with different platforms and kind of hard-learned lessons throughout the years. I want to start off by giving folks some general advice and what I like to think of as human advice. These are things that bloggers should think about when they're writing, and think about, excuse me, think about these things as it relates to human beings. Later, you'll see in this talk that we'll also be getting advice around algorithms and bots. But the first set of advice I would really give everybody, and I know I showed you that I have a lot of domains, but I would really, really recommend everybody today go out and purchase a custom domain. I have a pretty unique name. If you were to Google my name, Khalid Abuhakmeh, I would almost certainly always show up first in the search results. You could try that now while I'm talking, and that's kind of an advantage to me. If you have a name that's pretty common, like John Smith, it might be difficult to get that custom domain. So put some thought into purchasing a domain so that you can host your blogging platform. It's definitely the #1 thing I would recommend for everybody watching right now if they don't already have one. This is something I had to learn over a long period of time, but it's really important to remember that you as a writer are unique in the context of all ecosystems. We saw a lot of people today give talks about machine learning, syntax trees, and while there's other people doing those things, those folks bring a perspective that's unique and important to growing not just themselves, but the community. So there can be kind of some internal self-doubt when you're thinking about starting blogging and worried that the content that you're going to produce is potentially derivative of what other folks are already doing in the space. So if you're a .NET person, you might say, well, I know these other folks are better at blogging than me, and I shouldn't write the same stuff. But given the entire context of the work you're doing and the place that you're at right now, it's really important to think about the value that you can add. So don't be dismissive of yourself, and remember that you are really unique. From a high level standpoint, you can think about that like philosophically, but it's also important to distinguish yourself. Some things I've done to try to distinguish myself, other than obviously having a unique name, is put a little bit of effort into some branding. Um, on the left-hand side here, you can see what is essentially is a logo. It has kind of a synthwave, vaporwave style. It's something I like. I like that kind of aesthetic, and my blog kind of has that. I also take some time to create visual cards for each blog post that I end up writing. And I think that's important for me, as you'll see in a later slide, that it kind of sets you apart from other folks that are also blogging. And that adds to your uniqueness. You know, be inspired by other folks, but try to find your own voice. This is a really important point when you're starting to blog. Make sure that your content adds value. This is something I didn't really get early on when I started blogging. I was starting to write about things like, oh, I worked out today and I did 10 push-ups, or my wife and I went for a walk in the woods. And while those stories are nice and they're personal, I was treating my blog like a diary. And that that doesn't really help a lot of people to know that I did something that day. When you start writing, think about what the problem is and why you're writing and how it can help solve problems for people. The interesting part about adding value as well is that ultimately you end up repeating yourself anyways, so you find your old blog posts and actually end up helping yourself. So when you're writing, just make sure that there's a point and there's a value proposition to everything that you're writing. One of the ways I like to make sure that I'm adding value is by doing a little bit of research. This is a really great technique anybody can use today. Go into your favorite search engine, type in a term that you're interested in writing about, and look at the auto suggest. In this example, you can see that I'm using ASP.NET Core, and the suggestions are ASP.NET Core 3.1, ASP.NET Core Docs, middleware, configuration, cores. These are topics that other developers in your community are looking for and looking for answers for. This is a great opportunity for you to go to any one of those search results, look at the results, and see if you can do anything better than what's already there. Granted, right now in the .NET space, the Microsoft Docs team is doing a super great job in terms of writing content and helpful stuff. So it is becoming a little bit more competitive. But again, you're unique and you can add a lot of value to these topics that maybe the Microsoft Docs team or someone else hasn't. So keep this trick in mind when you're starting to blog. Speaking of community, it's really important to be engaged in the community that you're writing for. So as .NET advocates at JetBrains, we spend a lot of time on Twitter and social networks to kind of talk to developers. But I feel like everybody should really be doing that and understand where they fit within the community that they're a part of. I have some platforms here. Twitter is my favorite. You can reach me there at any point in time. I've also experimented with Practical Dev, which is dev.to, which is a great blogging platform if you want to start there. Reddit, and I know a lot of people are starting to experiment with video. So platforms like Twitch and YouTube are a great place to be engaged. Some techniques that I use to be engaged on Twitter is I actually have a blog promoter application. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's a little bit of a code snippet there. It just picks a random post from my RSS feed and it decides to tweet it. And you can see on the right-hand side is what that tweet looks like on Twitter. you can kind of see the effort that I put into the branding side of things really pays off when those tweets come through in someone's timeline. So again, a lot of these small tips and tricks, they can really add up to a huge impact. You can actually look at the entire code base on github.com under my blog promoter repo, but to be honest, it's one program.cs file that does everything. It's pretty straightforward. One of my favorite things that I've just adopted in the last year is writing on a schedule. This isn't something I really used to do in the past. I would just write whenever I kind of felt like it, and it kind of showed in my blogging pattern. I would write, 5 blog posts in 1 week and then nothing for months, and that wasn't really consistent. The thing I like to think about when I think about blogging is one of my favorite analogies, which is each blog post is kind of like a thimble in the rain. And what you're trying to do is catch as much water as you humanly possibly can. So the more you write and the more consistent you are, the more readers you'll potentially get. So something that I do to keep myself on schedule, I've written a Thor command, which you can kind of see how this is done on my blog. It's a simple command that I just say Jekyll info, and what it tells me is today's date, which is nice information to have. It tells me my latest blog post. It also tells me if I was to write another blog post, what date would that post be published on? And then I also have a backlog of days away that my post will be. So in 77 days, I'll run out of content, which it keeps me motivated to make sure that I'm providing as much content as possible, and also not feel the stress and pressure of having to constantly produce stuff. 77 days for me is a pretty comfortable buffer. You can kind of also see the latest posts that I have in this Thor command. And again, below you can see my iCal calendar, and I just have a recurring calendar event that tells me to write a blog post. So that's super important. One of the things, I've talked about blogging on a lot of platforms, and the thing I regret the most is kind of stopping and quitting. Just getting inside my own head and realizing well, maybe there's some other people doing it better, or I'm not adding anything. And every time I start back up, I regret kind of stopping that momentum. I would say make sure you don't quit and you stay consistent. I know life gets in the way, but you won't regret staying on this path once you start it. So please don't quit. The community needs you, and it's fun to read what other people are doing. So I talked a lot about human advice. That's stuff related to you. And humans have a lot to do with your readership, but sadly, bots have even more to do with your readership. They don't feel things. They don't really care about you, but they're super critical to getting humans who care about you to you. So I'm going to give you some advice that I've kind of learned over time as I structured my blog. Bots love semantics, and what I mean by semantics is make sure that your HTML is structured properly. As developers, we may sometimes want to focus on the back-end side of things and maybe not understand what's happening on the front end. So we may cheat to get the styling we want by using things like H1, H2, and H3 tags incorrectly. This can have a huge detriment on your traffic because when a bot crawls your site, and when a bot crawls your site, it's looking for these header tags. H1 is basically what is the content that is on this page. And if a bot finds 20 of them on a page, well, it's going to get confused and it's not really going to think your page is valuable for really anybody. This is something I learned the hard way. I used to cram a bunch of like buzzwords into titles, and it doesn't really help as much as you think it's going to help. You may want to be as expressive as possible when writing a page title. You know, like parsing syntax trees for F#, using Phantasmo for Rider. Like there's a lot of content there, but the truth is when you go look at a search result, you're going to notice that Google or DuckDuckGo, they cut it off at 70 characters. So as much value as you can fit into under 70 characters, you should kind of distill your titles down to less than 70 characters if possible. This is something else that I kind of experimented with and realized it was a waste of my time. I used to experiment with things like hyper short posts, like a sentence or two and then a code block, but those barely get any traffic. I found with my content, you need to at least write 300 words. And normally I target between 700 and 1,000 words when writing any blog post. I know it can be daunting, but with a little bit of practice, most folks can definitely get there. Also, the thing you have to realize too is when Google comes to your site and finds a bunch of code samples, it can't compile or understand any of those code samples. So take the time to actually explain in human language what your code samples are doing, and that will help add additional words and additional value to your blog posts. Another thing that Google has really started putting an emphasis on is performance of your site. Things like unoptimized images, blocking JavaScript, those are going to hurt your site's ability to show up in search results. So be mindful when you're reaching for that, you know, heavy front-end framework, or you're putting 4K images and downsizing them to thumbnails. That's really going to hurt your site. This particular issue here, where we're optimizing for mobile, has become super important in the last decade. I still find a lot of developers read my site on their desktop computers, and about 75% of readers want to read on their desktop. But Google has started boosting people's sites that are optimized for mobile. What that means is optimized images and responsive design to be displayed on someone's mobile phone or tablet. So while my readership is really geared towards desktop readers, I still need to do this just so that I don't lose out in more readers. Ultimately, I know all this stuff because I'm measuring this, and Google Analytics is a great tool. I know where people are coming to my blog from around the world, what topics they're interested in, breakdown and demographic. And I think that's super important as you're on your blogging journey to understand why people are coming to read your content. So if you're watching this on YouTube, sitting on your couch, I've included a QR code. If you take a picture of this, you'll be able to get to Google's SEO Starter Guide. And you'll kind of see Google makes no secret of how they actually rank your site. And it's a great place to start if you're thinking about blogging. So I know a lot of people have differing levels of competency or technical experience. So I've kind of broken down 3 options that anyone can take. The first option, if you're just a complete technical novice or you're just kind of uncomfortable managing your own blog, is just going with an online service. I actually have picked 2 online services that I would recommend. And I'll kind of break down the pros and cons later. The first one, which has kind of garnered a lot of, you know, hype and a lot of people use it, even news outlets, is medium.com. You can go sign up for medium.com right now. This is what their UI looks like. And it's a very bare bones experience. It's really targeted for anyone who's non-technical. And you can kind of see what options they offer. You can add some basic tagging, you can share to social media outlets, and you can kind of bounce through each one. WordPress.com is another really good option. It's kind of the OG of blogging. This is their blog as a service offering. It looks really similar to Medium, and logging in, you kind of can see some of the things you can do. You can have a header, you can create basic bulleted points, links, you can put tags, you can upload and set featured images over here. So it's really similar, and it's a bare bones experience, and you can get started blogging today. The real pros of these platforms are they're free-ish, I should say. They're managed for us. Being managed for us is good because we don't have to think about that database upgrade or that security vulnerability, and we also don't have to pay out any money for that. The other thing I like about these platforms too is there's a community cross promotion that occurs that maybe can't occur if you are hosting your own platform, which that can drive more readers to your blog. So these platforms are great to kind of grow your audience very quickly on the back of other people's work. So here are some cons with these platforms and maybe why I wouldn't recommend you look at them. There are upsells all the time. These companies have to make money. That's how businesses work. They need money to keep themselves afloat. So what they're going to do is they're going to target you with ads constantly, and that can get really, really annoying. I know it was annoying for me when I logged into WordPress.com. They were constantly trying to sell me domains and themes, and it was just kind of distracting overall. This next one I don't like personally, just from looking at the stuff that I've done with my own personal branding. These things can kind of be bland. WordPress.com has a lot of themes, but Medium has adopted this kind of flat design aesthetic. And it's actually kind of been interesting to watch Medium struggle with their flat design. News outlets that have journalistic integrity, vetting processes, they look exactly the same as some crazy crackpot person in their basement. And that kind of hurts everybody who ends up blogging in those communities. Which kind of brings me to my next con, which is community noise. At the end of your blog posts, you may be promoting, or it may look like you're promoting something that you would never promote, and that can kind of hurt you as well. Ultimately, these are for-profit companies, so when you're investing in their platform, you're adding value for them in the hopes that you get value. And if they decide to change their mind, you can kind of be at their mercy. So this is a good place for people to start, but I would definitely try to steer you away from some of these services. So let's say you've been blogging for a little bit, you're getting really, really confident, you're growing your readership. This is probably where these next two options are probably where I would focus most people. And it would be like a self-managed platform. One of the popular ones out there is Ghost. It's written on Node.js. And you can kind of see how the UI looks, and they have a mobile app, which is kind of great. And it looks very similar to what Medium and WordPress.com offered. The nice thing about Ghost too is it has some social capacity. So you can see on the left-hand side, there's members and staff. So you can kind of work together as a team to build a blogging outlet. Another option, not to be confused with WordPress.com, is WordPress.org. It's a self-hosted platform. It runs on PHP, and Ghost actually got a lot of inspiration from WordPress. You can kind of see it offers posts, pages. There's also a lot of custom themes, so you don't have to look like everybody else. And there's a lot of plugins for WordPress. The nice thing about these self-managed platforms is you own it. You own the whole thing from the front end, from your posts, custom domain. It's something that is yours and no one can kind of take away from you, which is really nice. They also come with really strong WYSIWYG editors. If you're not familiar with that, it's what you see is what you get editors. So if you like writing in Microsoft Word, these are going to be right up your alley. They also come with a lot of plugins. I showed you how I do my Twitter promotion, but these platforms have plugins to do things like automatic tweeting and RSS feeds and publishing on schedules. So they're really nice. And being that they're popular, they have a lot of community support. So you're never going to feel like you're out in left field by yourself trying to maintain these platforms. With popularity comes risks. A lot of these platforms are hacker targets. WordPress is definitely the most popular blogging platform, easily by a mile on the planet. Like it's the thing most places run. And due to that, they can really become targets for hackers. So you kind of have to make sure you stay up on security updates and issues like that. They can also be slow. They obviously talk to a database on the back end, and that can add latency to your site, which again, if you remember back earlier, performance is a really huge indicator in terms of whether these search engines determine your value as a blog. And at the end of the day, they can kind of feel like pets to me, constantly managing security updates, databases, paying for hosting. That stuff just kind of gets in the way of writing for me. And it's not fun after a while when you maybe log in and you see there's like 100 security updates you need to install. Needing to run all this stuff with a backend database too, that's just going to cost you money. I think on DigitalOcean, it costs about $5 a month to run just a bare bones site. And I would recommend that. But again, that's $5. And right now, I basically pay nothing to host my site. So we're up to kind of the advanced topic at this point. And this is kind of what I would focus most people on. This is how I blog. And I can kind of show you at the end of this talk, like how my blog actually runs on my machine. But since I'm talking to a technical audience right now, this is where I would steer everybody on this talk to at least try. And if you don't like it, try the intermediate level. The thing I would recommend most people start off with a static site generator is just use GitHub Pages. It works really great, and I'm about to show you 5 steps to just get started without even playing with the command line or doing anything like that. So the first step is to create a repository, preferably your username if you have a GitHub account, .github.io. What that does is GitHub offers everyone GitHub pages at their at this particular URL, and if you name a repository like that, that will be kind of your domain. The first step is to create a _config.yaml file. I've picked this Minima theme, which is really great. I've seen a lot of people use this theme, and it works really well for those folks, and I would recommend it. So first step, right in the GitHub UI, just go ahead and create an _config.yaml file and put this one-liner. By the way, if you want to see this live, you can go to my repo here. It's published right there. The next step is to add an index.md file at the root of your repo. And we just want to create just this content here. We're going to set the layout to home. Just making sure. Yep. The fourth step is to create a directory of _posts, and we're going to create our first hello world post. And using Markdown, we can just put these 2 lines in it. The first one is a header, and if you're not familiar with Markdown, using the hash basically says this is an H1. You can actually add multiple hashes, and it'll go down the list of header tags of H1, H2, H3. And then the content is just, you know, plain text, which is great. This step is probably not necessary if you named your repo the right way, but I like to just check my GitHub settings just to make sure that the URL is done correctly. You should see your site is published at the top, and then you can kind of go to it. And if you followed this exactly, which there really wasn't a lot of steps, you should have your own blog up and running. So hopefully everyone listening today at least does this, and they can start blogging today. That's kind of cool. So I'm a big fan of static site generators. What you just saw and what GitHub Pages supports is Jekyll. That's what I use for my blog. If you've gone to abuhakmeh.com, everything is generated at build time. And there's a lot of advantages to this, which I'll get to later, but I just love this format of blogging. It's really clean and simple. There's a lot of options out there for static site generators. I personally like Jekyll just because of its stability and maturity. It's been around forever. I also love 11t. 11t is based on JavaScript, and it's doing really great right now in the community. It's something I'd highly recommend if you're a JavaScript fan. Hugo is another static site generator. It's blazing fast. It's kind of crazy how fast it is. It's written in Go, and it can compile thousands of pages in like under a second. It's crazy. Sometimes I don't even think it's running right, but it is. It's doing its thing. And you can basically find a flavor of static site generator that works for you. On here I have static, which is written in C#. So if you want to stay in the .NET realm, it's definitely something I'd recommend. Like I said, I've been using Jekyll. I love it. It's pretty awesome. And you can kind of see what other people have done with Jekyll. There's a lot of GitHub repos out there. And you can fork those blogs and kind of see how they work under the covers. A lot of these static site generators also work off of Markdown. So if you're familiar with Markdown, it's pretty straightforward. I'll have a link to where you can learn about Markdown, but there's really two parts to most of these static site generator pages. There's the front matter, which is metadata. It sits on top of your content. And then there's the actual content of your blog post. In this example, you can see the front matter at the top of the page. It sets the layout, the title, subtitle, date, and permalink, and then the content is below. So the heart of every static site generator is just Markdown. And I think that's the thing I really love about them, and that's why I'd recommend them to any developer, because at the end of the day, it can just kind of help you focus on writing. Here's how I build my blog, and I can actually drop into the command line later to show you how it runs on my machine through command line. But basically, I just run a command, and within 6 seconds, my entire blog is built. I also pass in a future tag just so I can see those backlog of blog posts as I'm writing for the future. Excuse me. And the nice thing about a lot of these static site generators is they come with their own internal servers. So you can run all this stuff locally. And unlike a self-managed platform, you don't have to set up a database. You don't have to figure out permissions. You don't have to create a user local name or a local username. And you don't have to keep those synced with your production instance, which is kind of really nice for me. So this is pretty easy, right? You just write a bunch of Markdown, you build it, and then you deploy it. Not everything in life's really that easy. It's easy once you get the hang of it, but there is a lot of upfront stuff that you have to do with static site generators, and it can kind of be daunting at times. You have to figure out how tagging works. I'll be honest, the way tags work on my blog and pagination works on my blog, it's kind of annoying sometimes because there's no structure. The looseness of Markdown sometimes makes that difficult. Dates, multiple authors, dealing with the semantics of Open Graph so you can get those fancy Twitter card images. All this stuff kind of starts to get overwhelming and daunting. So, but honestly, don't be discouraged. I really want you to look at a static site generator. The first thing I'd recommend anybody do when they're looking at starting a blog, buy a professional theme. This is a site, I'm not really affiliated with it, but I'm really impressed with their themes. And for $50, they've thought of most of everything for you. So paging, SEO, all the stuff you want, you can just kind of get started, and their themes look pretty great. So I would definitely check them out. And think about it, most of you are professionals. $50 versus hours and hours and hours of time spent fiddling, it's a deal. So I definitely recommend that. So what are the pros of a static site generator? For me personally, it's about full control. When you're thinking about a self-managed platform, you kind of have to figure out what their programming model is. WordPress is very difficult sometimes. especially someone who doesn't do PHP. And these static site generators deal a lot with static files, so it's very easy to see how it all kind of comes together. So full control is really awesome with these things. I talked a lot about focus and writing and how I love Markdown because of that. And I can't overstate it enough. Like when you're blogging, you want to focus on writing, and a lot of these other platforms that are kind of PHP or node based, you can lose focus when you're in a WYSIWYG editor. Should this line be highlighted? Should I make this word bigger? Should I put the images on the left or the right? And that can kind of detract from your momentum. The nice thing too about static site generators is they're very flexible. So writing in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you can kind of basically do anything. So I love it for that. And as developers, I think everybody wants, a few options there. One of the things I don't like about static site generators is they can definitely be fiddly. I love 11T. I would recommend it to everybody. And there's a lot of extension points, but you can kind of get lost kind of tuning your car rather than driving it. And I think a lot of these static site generators can kind of get lost in that. Again, you want to focus on writing. You don't want to spend all your time building this supercar and never actually getting to drive it. And I think static site generators can sometimes be that kind of trap, which again makes you lose focus from the reason you started a blog, which is to write. So keep that in mind when you pick these platforms. You want to write stuff. You don't want to keep fiddling with it. This last one probably isn't a problem for most people, but as you start to add more content and more pages, your build time can increase, and that can kind of ruin your feedback loop. I don't want you to be discouraged. I know I had a few cons there, but I still would really, really recommend you look at a static site generator. There's a lot of cool things you can do. One of my favorite things is being that they're mostly static files, we can cache, and we can cache really, really hard. What that means is we can push our content into CDNs. We could even cache most of our content on the user's device so that you can get things like offline mode. You can serve people directly from their country. So I host my blog on Netlify, and they push to their CDN, which means folks in Japan, folks in Europe, they get the same exact experience reading my blog that someone in the United States would, which is a huge benefit to me. Whereas if I was to host my blog in the Eastern US, only people in the United States would get the best experience reading my blog. Whereas, folks in Japan or folks in Europe, they'd get a degraded experience because, yeah, my hosting is in the United States. The other thing about static sites is it's basically cheap or free. I mentioned I host on Netlify. There's other static site options out there for hosting static sites, and they're basically free. What a lot of these companies are trying to do is upsell you on, APIs and functions to increase the capability of your site. But if you're just writing a blog, they'll basically give you static hosting for free. I can't understate how awesome Markdown is. You may not really get it until you start writing and you realize you kind of crank out a lot of content, and that's really cool. And Markdown has changed my relationship with writing completely. I think it's the most transformative technology in the last 20 years, at least for me. So I've kind of gone through all the options you could have to starting a blog, from baby steps to intermediate to advanced using static site generators. But it really comes down to engaging with humans and engaging with the community. Remember that you're not just working or writing within a bubble. There's a whole community that you're hoping to impact and to help. As much as humans are the folks you're trying to reach, you kind of also have to think about robots. They're kind of a necessary evil when it comes to the internet. Not that they're evil, I mean, they're robots, but they're really going to be what drives traffic to your blog. Most of my blog traffic, maybe 90% of it, actually comes from organic searches. So you really, really have to think about them. The other reason that I'm really pushing static site generators, and you should really think about this, is you want to help yourself and you want to help your community. And that means taking ownership in the content that you create. While I like Medium and I like WordPress.com as technical options, when you write on those platforms, you are investing in their value and hoping to get value for yourself. Whereas when you buy a custom domain and you host it yourself, that is your value. So really think about taking ownership. And finally, I would just say, just do it. You know, I know the internet is kind of a scary place sometimes. I've gotten my fair share of comments and you're doing this wrong, and those kind of hurt sometimes. But I've also gotten emails from folks thanking me for writing a blog post that saved them weeks. And that makes me feel great too. And when you get those kind of comments, it's really motivating. So I would just really, really recommend you do it. So I also want to offer, you can reach me on Twitter. This is a QR code. Again, if you're sitting on your couch, just take a picture and it should come right up. You can also read a lot of the technical ideas and how they're kind of spelled out on my blog. So if you go there, you can kind of see the mechanics of it. I also have office hours, and I'd love to talk to anybody who wants to start their blogging journey. So you can actually go to my blog. There, you should see an office hours at the top, and you can schedule time to sit with me. I don't charge, not yet, I don't think. I'm not sure I ever will, but if you just want 30 minutes, I'm glad to talk to you. So with that, again, thanks to JetBrains and thanks to everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Khalid, for a very inspiring session. As one of the audience members said, it's time to wipe the cobwebs off of my blog and get to it again. So you've inspired some people, which is always great.
Cool.
There are a couple of questions, though. A couple of philosophical ones and a couple of process ones on how you write. So what do you want first?
Surprise me, I guess I should say.
All right. What do you feel is in it for you? What is the main reason for starting and writing a blog for you? Why not just be on Twitter?
I guess for me, it's nice to have a long form idea. You know, the issue I have with Twitter is I love communicating with people, but it's very ethereal. If you put your answers and you put your value into Twitter, kind of like I mentioned at the end, that kind of just evaporates immediately. You know, what I got out of blogging too is folks I really admire. Um, Maybe this is for you, Martin. I know I've said this to you personally, but I really admire your blog, and there's a lot of people in the .NET space I admire, and I'm really happy that they blog because it really pushes me. And if I can do that for just one other person, that's great. But you know, now I work with Martin, which is awesome. He's one of my .NET heroes, and I get to work with him. So I kind of got that out of blogging. So that's a plus. You can
Well,
stop crying. You can
I'm
stop
blushing
crying
now.
now, Martin. Yeah, I know.
All right, couple of practical things. You have that writing schedule in your calendar. Does that actually help you motivate to write things? What do you do if you have so-called writer's block, even though your agenda says you have to write something?
Well, you know, it's funny. I found that writing even things that you take for granted are really, really good blog posts. Like, those are the ones that are gonna take off. Whereas I could spend a week trying to create this elaborate tech demo, and I don't get nearly as many readers as just describing how equality works in C sharp. So, how do you get over writer's block? Just don't take any of your knowledge for granted. You might think, oh, well, everybody knows this, but it's really something you can elaborate on and just do a little differently. So um, I do get writer's block, and scheduling out, it's a motivator, but I think the backlog helped me feel like I'm not pressured into writing. Like this week, I wrote a companion blog on this talk that you can kind of go read and get specific details. So if I can stay within 2 to 3 blog posts a week, I feel pretty good. If I drop down to one, I still feel pretty good. So there's a lot of ways to combat the pressure, I guess. Hopefully that answers that person's question.
I I would guess it does. Let's switch back to a more technical slash practical one,
Uh-huh.
which would be we're talking about social, Twitter, blogs, and so on. But then we're also talking about static site generators. Those typically don't allow comments on a blog post. How do you handle those? What do you think about comments? How do you handle all that?
Yeah, I currently use Discuss, Disqus. I think that's how you spell Discuss. I felt like a cheerleader there for a second, but uh, I use Discuss for
Hopefully,
commenting. Uh, the nature of static sites is you're going to have to use APIs. I'm not sure if folks have heard of Jamstack. I know Jamstack is kind of a buzzword lately. Um, Jamstack stands for JavaScript APIs and Markup. And the APIs are an important part of bringing dynamic feeling elements into your page. So Discuss is one of those. In terms of comments, I like folks leaving comments, but it's a performance killer. I've actually started lazy loading my comments just because they can really drastically change the loading time of your pages. And again, it hurts your traffic. So if you don't feel there's a lot of value in comments, I would just say leave them off, but I like interacting with people. Yeah.
all right, thanks. Then maybe one final question. What is for you the typical time investment for writing a blog post? How many hours a week do you spend? And how does that break down into trying out something, writing a code sample, and actually doing the writing?
That's a very loaded question, just due to the fact that it depends, right? I hate I hate to answer
Have
with
you
it
been a
depends.
consultant?
I mean, I guess I could hire a writing staff. That would make things easier, but that would defeat the purpose of having my own unique voice. Uh, no, but in all seriousness, it takes time in terms of what you want to write about. If you're writing about something that's already researched, like you're using Microsoft Docs as kind of a way to elaborate on stuff, those kind of blog posts don't take that long. I would say maybe a couple hours. If you get good at it, you could probably even get faster. I recommend tools like Grammarly because they can kind of give you a second set of eyes when you're writing and help you kind of catch problems before you have to go back and reread everything. So that can cut down on a lot of time. But again, if you're doing something super complicated, like I wrote a Xamarin post for JetBrains, and that took a little bit of time because I've never really done Xamarin stuff before. So it depends.
All right. I guess that's a fine conclusion. It depends. With that, let's switch back to my screen. I want to thank you again for a very interesting session. And I think at least a couple of people are inspired to start blogging or start blogging again. So that's always good.